Thank you all for having me today. And like David said, I'm from the economics department, so please interrupt me with your hardest questions. I look forward to the hardest questions in particular. So today I'm going to be talking about the short and long run impacts of centralized clearinghouses. So your first question might be, what's a centralized clearinghouse? The most prominent example of a centralized clearinghouse is the National Resident Matching Program, which you might be familiar with if you have any friends who recently graduated from medical school. It's the system by which all new doctors in the United States are matched to residency positions in hospitals. So under the National Residency Matching Program, doctors and hospitals meet, have interviews, just like in any labor market. But in contrast to a decentralized market, where a hospital might make an offer to a particular doctor and then contract negotiations would begin, doctors submit a rank-ordered list of their preferences over hospitals. Hospitals similarly submit a rank-ordered list of their preferences over doctors, and then an algorithm determines a single match. Now, this is an education talk. Why am I talking about doctors? Well, these clearinghouses are becoming more and more common, and they're actually used to assign new teachers to teaching positions in 4 countries, including France, Mexico, Turkey, and Uruguay. So if you look globally, these centralized clearinghouses are affecting labor markets. Now, part of the reason that we're seeing an increased use of centralized clearinghouses is that in the last 2 decades, economists have increasingly taken on this role of economic engineer, where they go into markets that aren't functioning optimally and try to redesign the market in order to make it function better. Now, unfortunately, in contrast to traditional engineering, it's a little bit more difficult to evaluate how well economic engineering is performing. So, what is the impact of these centralized clearinghouses that are being implemented by economists all over the world on match outcomes? It's actually pretty difficult to get a credible answer to this question. There are 2 main challenges. So if you think about what is the unit of observation when thinking about measuring the impact of these clearinghouses, it's the entire market. So thinking back to the National Resident Matching Program, there's a single market for new doctors in the United States that spans the entire country. So if you wanted a comparison market, you would need to find some other national market that was comparable to the United States market for doctors and using a different mechanism for some random reason.
So before you get into all the methodological challenges, can you tell us why it might be a good idea to do this and have such a market as opposed to some other way of teachers finding jobs?
So, great question. So just to preview why these markets might be desirable. So if you consider the market for teachers in Chicago, for example, teachers have to apply to each school individually. It's a completely decentralized system, but all of the schools are regulated by Chicago Public Schools. So the labor market for teachers in Chicago isn't necessarily not functioning optimally, but you may be able to reduce the application costs of teachers by adopting a centralized system where instead of having to submit 20 applications, they have to submit a single application, and then the school, that might be good for the schools who would then have an expanded applicant pool.
Okay, so let me follow up. So now the example you gave, because I had this picture in my mind of a national clearinghouse for teachers, and it sounded very unrealistic.
Yeah.
A lot of people who go into teaching go into it because they wanted to work near home.
Yes.
So now you're saying actually these could be a multiplicity of local clearinghouses.
Yeah, so the national...
I just want to understand what the scope of this and how it's really going to be, or how you might organize it.
So,
because now we have to decide what are the boundaries of these things, etc.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And the National Resident Matching Program is a very particular example that's very prominent. But these could be, today I'm going to talk about an application that's actually a subset of teachers in Chicago that in particular Teach for America teachers. So an even smaller scope than some localized sector, but in thinking about the external validity or the external applications of this, I think that a reasonable bound on what the market would be defined at would be like a large urban school district. Okay, so the second challenge, so the first challenge was that the unit of observation is a market. The second challenge is that you need uniformly measured outcomes by which to evaluate it. So you can say, here's the impact on how productive teachers are being, for example. The previous evidence is limited by the fact that all of the previous papers have used ex post research designs, meaning that markets changed what mechanism they were using for some reason independent of the researchers, and then the researchers evaluated it after the fact. Today, I'm going to present evidence from the first field experiment, which I ran, designed to evaluate the impact of these centralized clearinghouses on match outcomes. So to give you a little background of this, I contacted Teach for America in fall 2013. I was aware of how they were matching teachers to schools, and I suggested you might benefit from adopting a new mechanism based on these centralized clearinghouses. This was implemented with evaluation in mind as a non-randomized field experiment. So in the winter and spring of 2014, when Teach for America's 2014 cohort of teachers, whose first year of teaching would have been the 2014-15 school year, were finding teaching positions, I worked with Teach for America to match its high school teachers using one of these clearinghouse mechanisms while they continued to use their baseline mechanism to match their elementary school teachers. And then I am able to evaluate this more credibly than the prior research using a difference in difference design, which I'll talk about in more detail later in the presentation. So the big contribution of this is that it's the first field experimental evidence about the impact of these clearinghouses. And I observe both short and longer term outcomes up to 2 years after the match is implemented. And from the perspective of education, it's the first evaluation that attempts to, in a quasi-experimental way, vary how teachers are being matched to schools, and it will have suggestive evidence about whether we can improve student outcomes by changing how teachers are assigned to schools. I do want to be upfront that no study is perfect. There are a few limitations to keep in mind. So first, the counterfactual here isn't a decentralized market. Like, it's not how teachers are normally assigned to schools in Chicago. It's Teach for America's baseline mechanism, which I'll show you gave teachers almost no autonomy over where they were being assigned. So that's the benchmark these treatment effects are being measured against. The second is I don't observe outcomes for non-TFA teachers who might have also been affected if a school hired a TFA teacher instead of that teacher. So there might be some spillovers I'm missing. And finally, not all teachers were actually matched by these mechanisms. So you can think of it as kind of an intent to treat design if you're familiar with the program evaluation literature. But with that said, this is still the best evidence we have to date of the impact of centralized clearinghouses. To give you a preview of the results I'm going to show today, in terms of matches, I show that using the centralized clearinghouses, Teach for America teachers sorted into lower performing Chicago public schools. So this is relative to higher performing Chicago public schools and schools in Northwest Indiana, which Teach for America Chicago also places teachers in. And even though these teachers shifted to lower performing schools, which you might think might be a more challenging teaching position, the teachers preferred these assignments. And we can see that this preference plays out in the long term. It increased teachers' retention through the 2-year commitment to Teach for America by 9.9 percentage points, which is about a 17% increase in retention, or put another way, a 26% reduction in attrition. Somewhat surprisingly, while teachers were happier, they weren't more effective. Using Teach for America's preferred performance measure, which I'm going to talk about when I get there, I find that teachers' performance decreased by 0.3 standard deviations of this measure. Now, that's somewhat ambiguous. Like, was this clearinghouse better for Teach for America? So first, let's step back and think what we should expect. So in the theoretical literature, these clearinghouses were developed to find a stable match, in the sense that any teacher and school that are matched together prefer that match over any other match that they could have gotten. They prefer their assigned match to being matched together if they aren't matched. What they weren't designed to do is maximize student performance, which might be the outcome that the people in this room are interested in. That said, on balance, despite the kind of mixed evidence I just previewed, the evidence does suggest that the new mechanism was better. I say that for 2 reasons. First, I'll show you that this 0.3 standard deviation decline in performance can be explained almost entirely by the shift of teachers from higher performing to lower performing schools, and seems to be more of a limitation to how they're measuring performance. Second, it was revealed preference indicates that it was better because Teach for America adopted it for all of their teachers over the following 2 years. So, just to give you an outline of where we're heading, first I'm going to describe the setting, Chicago Public Schools and teacher labor markets in general first, and then I'll give you a lot more detail about Teach for America than you may want, although in this room you guys may already know it. Then I'll describe the two mechanisms in detail. Since they're relatively obscure mechanisms, I don't expect anyone's too familiar with them. I'll discuss the empirics, and then we'll get to the short and long run outcomes. Any questions so far?
When you say TFA, are you only specifically ever talking about TFA Chicago or?
Yeah, so my application is Teach for America Chicago and Northwest Indiana. Okay. So it's basically Chicago Public Schools and then Gary and Hammond, Indiana. In the paper, I show results using 4 other regions as an additional control. But all of the changes are happening with Teach for America Chicago. Okay, so people in this room probably know more about teachers than me, so I don't want to spend too much time on this. But there are a few facts to keep in mind about teacher labor markets, which I think are actually a very natural application for these mechanisms to give a better answer to your question. So first, there are over 3.5 million full-time equivalent teachers in the United States. It's the modal occupation of college graduates. So this is a very important occupation for our country. We know that teachers are heterogeneous. Based on my read of the literature, a 1 standard deviation increase in teacher value added is associated with about a 0.1 standard deviation increase in test scores. And Chetty, Friedman, and Rokoff showed that the increase also translates into higher earnings in young adulthood. But teachers are also potentially mismatched. Most teachers are not assigned they're not paid based on how much impact they're having on kids. Instead, they're paid based on rigid contracts, based on their education and years of experience. And as a result, teachers' preferences over schools are driven by typically geographic preferences and demographics of the students, based on the literature investigating the determinants of their preferences. And there's some literature that recently is being challenged more, for sure, that suggests schools aren't able to predict teacher quality at the stage of hiring. And finally, these matches could be important because Jackson shows that up to a quarter of observed teacher quality is based on an idiosyncratic teacher-school match quality. Now, my application is Teach for America teachers, which are admittedly a very unique subset of the market. So Teach for America, if you're not familiar, is a large national nonprofit organization. In 2014, the year I worked with Teach for America, they recruited 5,300 teachers to teach in 53 regions across the United States. And it's an alternative certification program, and that's its main role. So Teach for America recruits what it would consider high human capital people who weren't intending to be teachers to teach in disadvantaged urban and rural schools for up to 2 years. Teach for America is not the teacher's employer. They're paid by the school. But Teach for America is responsible for giving them the credential to teach in that school. Several RCTs have shown that Teach for America teachers are at least as effective as traditionally trained teachers. So they seem to be successful. And they're an important segment of the Chicago teacher market. And they're about 15 to 20% of all new teachers in Chicago public schools every year. So just to give you an overview of Teach for America's model, I mentioned they're an alternative certification program. There are really 2 key aspects to their philosophy of how they can bring about change. They spend a lot of resources trying to identify people who are going to be effective teachers. So they spend about $11,000 per teacher that's recruited and selected to teach in a classroom. So they received over 50,000 applicants, and then they only selected 14% of them. So it's a very selective organization, and they spend a lot of resources trying to predict who's going to be effective in the classroom. And then they have a short summer boot camp because these people typically weren't intending to be teachers. So it's a 5 to 6 week summer institute where they're introduced to teaching. But because Teach for America doesn't employ them, once you're assigned to a region grade level subject area, when you're accepted to Teach for America, they need to they need to get you matched into a teaching position at a school. Now, when you're accepted to Teach for America, you might...
Before you flip the slide, can you say more about how they use the $11,000?
So it's mainly, yeah, it sounds like an absurd amount of money to recruit that many teachers. So they have...
11,000. You're saying for each applicant?
For every teacher who's selected. So it's not 11,000 times 50,000. It's like
seven. You mean that includes the training cost of the teachers?
No, it doesn't include the training cost. This is just recruitment and selection. So in Chicago, for example, there is a recruitment specialist who will specialize in University of Chicago, Northwestern, and they'll sometimes have multiple per city. So covering those positions is obviously the primary component of that. But then they also spend a lot of resources during selection. The whole office kind of shuts down and starts interviewing people for these positions. And they're accounting for...
Probably look through these 50,000 and they throw a bunch of them away. And then they find a smaller number to interview. And
yeah, exactly. So there's a...
And then do they do anything besides... They don't... Yeah.
So the interview process... Yeah, exactly. So the application process starts with like an online form where you have an essay about why you want to be a teacher, your educational background. So then after that stage, there's a phone interview. Some exceptional applicants don't have the phone interview. But if you pass the phone interview, there's a day-long in-person interview with multiple applicants. So there'll be like group discussions, practice teach. So it's a pretty in-depth interview. And then they put all of that into a score and try to use the score to predict who's going to be accepted.
Right. So earlier you said something about employers don't know much about who they're hiring. So now they do because of this?
So that's part of why I mentioned there's... Okay. I think that I'll show some evidence that suggests that schools can predict who's good. Recently, like the paper Brian Jacob presented here a couple years ago, he finds that when you look at all the information that's available, you can predict who's going to be effective. But I think prior to the last few years, there was a lot of research suggesting schools struggled to predict.
One of the advantages of Teach for America is that the employer is getting a lot more, they are getting a lot more information before the employer ever has.
Yeah, so the
knowledge about who's coming in is supposed to be increased a lot by Teach for America.
Yeah, so and the schools actually pay kind of a finder's fee to Teach for America for this service, knowing that Teach for America spent a lot of resources.
And the schools have to take it.
The school does not commit to take it. The school, if they want one of the people, chooses to take it. And that's part of what I'll be talking about today is getting the schools to hire the teachers.
Right, just to Steve's point, I think it's clear that the info that TFA gets doesn't get passed to the school. Instead, what TFA is selling to the school is that you screen these people.
Gotcha.
Right, so it's not that the school can then sort the pile.
Yeah, thank you. They'll share the resumes of the people, but they're not going to share, they wouldn't even share the scores with me as an independent researcher. So they're pretty secretive about that. Another question?
I was also going to say, I think they also commit to providing support like throughout your 2 years of the school. So not only do you have like this pre-screening process, but there's also like additional ongoing support. Yeah,
they have, each person has an individual manager of teacher leadership development who will periodically visit your classroom based on need. Okay, so when you're accepted to Teach for America, you've gone through this grueling application process, and you get an email saying there's a decision on the online portal. So the applicant goes on, they click status, and then they see a screen like this, hopefully, that says, congratulations, we're thrilled to invite you to the 2015 Teach for America Core. You've been assigned to teach high school science in Houston. Now I'm going to take advantage of this very specific assignment to create these comparison markets, because the teacher here is assigned to a region grade level market. So that's going to be really important for my research design, because I'm going to be comparing the high school market to the elementary market. But this is determined before they're placed in schools. This isn't an outcome of the match. The match is all conditional on them being assigned to this grade level. So that's an important feature that allows this to, that's really the foundation of my research design. Now, once teachers are placed in Chicago, once they're placed in the Chicago region, Teach for America Chicago tries to facilitate a match between teachers and schools at a series of interview days, which are attended by most of their teachers. So you can think of interview days as essentially speed dating sessions between teachers and schools. They're about 3.5 hours long, and over this morning or afternoon, schools and teachers are each given a schedule to interview with 7 different members of the other side of the market for 25 minutes. So schools get a resume packet before the interview day. Teachers learn their schedule the morning of the interview day. And they also weren't aware that we were doing this intervention, so they likely weren't like skipping out on this because of the intervention. Importantly, separate sessions are held for high school and elementary school teachers, which is where the intervention is going to take place. We're going to change the matching mechanism at the high school interview days, whereas we're going to keep it the same for the elementary interview days. Just a quick note on schedules. Schools can request particular interviews, but basically everyone wants to interview the one math teacher. I think of them as based on conversations with the single staff member that makes the schedules. I view them as approximately random. And like I said, teachers learn the schedule at the interview day. So just to give you an overview of what this intervention is, at their elementary school interview days, which is pre-K through 8th grade teachers, they continued to match with their baseline mechanism that they used before I worked with Teach for America, that I'm going to call the first offer mechanism. Under the first offer mechanism, you complete schools can hire after any interview, and the teacher can't refuse the offer. Because Teach for America's mission is that they put teachers where they're needed. So in keeping with this, they have a national policy of teachers accepting their first offer. So teachers are being hired in the first round, second round, throughout the course of the interview day. I replaced this first offer mechanism with the school position proposing deferred acceptance algorithm, which is the basis for many of these clearinghouses like the National Resident Matching Program. So under the deferred acceptance algorithm, you complete all interviews. Schools submit a rank order list over teachers that they're willing to hire. They're not required to hire anyone. And teachers rank all schools. This is keeping even schools that they might find unacceptable and keeping with the norm that they go where they're needed. And then once they've submitted these rankings, the match is determined by the deferred acceptance algorithm, which I'll explain in a few slides.
Probably should have asked this earlier, but does Teach for America comply with, I don't remember which grade level this was, but I think there's a No Child Left Behind law that you have to have a college degree in the subject you teach if you want to teach in that particular subject. Is it high school or is
how
that
they sort elementary from high school in the initial offer? They've already looked at your transcript to decide.
Exactly, so that's a big determinant of how, for example, in Illinois, you're required to have a Bachelor of Science in Math to teach math. So when I graduated from UChicago as an undergrad with a math BA, I would not have been qualified to teach math.
So that's only for high school?
It depends on the grade level there, but they account for all of the regional requirements, including national requirements, when they determine that assignment.
Okay.
David.
John, you already said that your counterfactual was pretty different from, well, you said it's different from what might happen in the real world, but I wanted to get a sense of how different the first offer mechanism might be from the way teachers would normally get hired. Because they generally do, they do go through an interview process of some sort.
So the first offer mechanism is similar to some things we see in the real world. I'm going to go over it in detail in the next slide. But it's, in some ways, the deferred acceptance algorithm is more similar to how teachers are placed in schools in Chicago. Because teachers kind of apply where they want to, and then the schools make offers. It's implemented in a decentralized way, but it's more similar. The first offer mechanism is actually very similar to how federal clerkships for federal courts are awarded to law students. There's a norm there that law students don't say no to federal judges. And it's also similar to many markets adopt these clearinghouses because of problems where the timing of hires moves earlier and earlier. In the 1940s, the market for doctors were being hired typically in their second year of 4 in medical school, which seemed very undesirable. So they implemented this clearinghouse to adopt it. And similar to those, there's an incentive to kind of hire earlier in the day. So it's very different still, but it's similar in some ways to those. So just to give you more detail about how this actually works. So in the first round, let's say we have 3 schools and 3 teachers, just in a simplified example. So the first thing you do is you have your first round interview. So you have the interview. After that interview, the school decides right away, do I want to hire the teacher I just met? So let's say school 1 wants to hire teacher 1. Now, this teacher can't refuse the offer, so they accept it and are removed from the interview day. So now we have round 2, where there are only 2 schools and 2 teachers. Again, they interview. The school decides, do I want to hire them? And let's say school 3 wants to hire teacher 2. The school 2 has already met teacher 3, so that's all the interviews we can have. So this is our match, and this school and that teacher remain unmatched. So a few things to note about this. So in my paper, I show that schools should use a threshold strategy. So basically, they might know, like, this is the bar for how, if I don't hire a TFA teacher, this is who I would hire. But over the course of the day, they're going to have a lower and lower standard of who they want to hire. So that's kind of how schools should behave under this optimally. But it does encourage schools to hire with limited info. The next person they're going to interview might be their favorite person in the world, but they don't know that when they're hiring in that previous round. And teachers have almost no say over this, over what's happening to them. Of course, they can quit Teach for America, but then they have to go find another job. So we replaced it with the deferred acceptance algorithm. And the first big change is that all interviews are completed before any hiring happens. So all interviews are completed. This is an example of a school ranking form. So the school has a reminder of who they met with. There might have been math and English and social studies teachers. Then they submit a rank ordered list. So teacher A might have been their favorite, then teacher 2, for each position they want to hire for. So then these are entered into the computer, and the deferred acceptance algorithm is used to implement a match. So again, all this is happening on the computer. No one's actually being rejected in a face-to-face interview. So it's the school proposing. So the algorithm looks at every school's rank ordered list and says, who's your most preferred teacher? So here, school 1 prefers teacher 1, school 2 and 3 prefer teacher 2. So they make a proposal to that teacher. Then the algorithm shifts to the teachers and says, if you got 1 offer, well, you had to rank everyone so it's acceptable. You tentatively accept it. Teacher 2 got 2 offers though, so her preferences are used to break the tie and pick which of those schools to go to. So she selects her more preferred school. But now school 3 is unmatched because its offer was rejected. So in the next stage, school 3 can change to make an offer to teacher 1, who is only tentatively matched. Now this teacher has 2 offers. Again, his preferences can break the tie. And let's say he prefers school 3. School 1's unmatched. Let's say they make an offer to teacher 3. Now everyone has a single offer. Since teachers had to rank all schools, this is our final match. Now, a few things to note about this. So teachers might still get matched at a school that they find unacceptable because they were required to rank all schools. But they have no incentive to manipulate the order of their preferences. So their best strategy is just saying, I like school 1 the best, I'm going to report school 1 the best. There's no risk in being honest to the algorithm. And similarly, schools have no risk in reporting the order correctly, although they might have some incentive. You can think of pretty complicated examples where schools can benefit from like truncating their preferences and saying that a teacher who is actually acceptable isn't acceptable to them. Now, just as a reminder, what does the theory say about these? So the deferred acceptance algorithm was developed to find a match that is acceptable for, so if a teacher and a school aren't matched, they prefer their match over being matched. Otherwise it would be unstable because the match would break down because people would start matching outside of the algorithm. So this motivates looking at retention as an outcome because the algorithm is designed to kind of maximize retention in the match. But the deferred acceptance is not designed to maximize how productive these teachers are. But in economics, we often have a passion. We build churches across the street for markets because we have these welfare theorems that say that markets are efficient. So the standard benchmark we use to evaluate markets is maximizing productivity. So that motivates looking at the impact of these clearinghouses on productivity. So to finally get to the empirical background, just to give you a few summary statistics of my data, which is administrative data provided by Teach for America with a data agreement. There are just 3 things I want to highlight. So this column is high school, and this column is elementary. It's all teachers in Chicago from the 2008 cohort of Teach for America teachers through the 2014 cohort. So this first row is their college GPA. It's about a 3.5 to 3.6, which is pretty good. It's consistent with them being a selective organization. I don't observe the particular teachers' test scores, but I see where they go to college. So I use the 75th percentile math SAT score as a proxy for how selective the college is. And they're coming from schools with about a 660 on the SAT math, which is also pretty good. And then finally, I observed their college majors, and about 3 to 6% of them were education majors, suggesting that Teach for America is successful in recruiting people who weren't intending to be teachers, if not for being selected for Teach for America. Okay, now,
What's 52 versus 13?
so that's STEM, and that's part of why it is an important detail that if part of your assignment is based on what you're qualified to teach. So if you're not a math major, you're not qualified to teach high school math in Illinois. So my identification strategy allows for level differences. I'll go into, well, we can talk about whether this is a concern.
I understand they don't have, I understand the
Yeah. Okay, but that's a great point that on average, these high school teachers are different than elementary school teachers, for sure. Thanks for pointing that out. Okay, so I'm going to look at several short and long-term outcomes. I've previewed some of these. So first, I'm going to look at interview day attendance and hiring, because not all TFA teachers go to one, and if they go to one, they're not necessarily hired at one. You can think of this as kind of participation in the intervention. I'll talk about the impact on sorting across schools. Given that schools don't commit to hiring, a different subset of schools hire these teachers because of the algorithm. And I'm going to talk about, I observe the teachers' truthful preference reports and the school's preference reports. So I simulate the old mechanism, and I'm able to say how their preferences over their assigned matches changed. And then finally, I look at retention through the 2-year commitment to Teach for America. I unfortunately don't observe retention and teaching after that. And I'll use Teach for America's preferred performance measure, which I'll explain when we get there. That way it's fresh in your mind. Now I use a difference in difference research design. So let's say the intervention happens here. The idea here is there might be level differences. So here, let's say this is high school and this is elementary school. This is fake data, just to illustrate the method. There are average differences, but what this method requires is that the change in the elementary market is a valid counterfactual for the change in the high school market. So then, after the program, we observe, let's say the elementary market sees a decrease. We're going to use that decrease as the estimated change that would have happened in the high school market if we hadn't intervened. So then if it shoots up like this, the difference between this estimated counterfactual and the observed outcome is how we'll estimate the treatment effect. So the identifying assumption here, like I said, is that the change in the elementary market is a valid counterfactual for the change in the high school market. The kind of things that you should think about as threats to this identification strategy is anything that happens in the year of the intervention that differentially affects the high school market compared to the elementary market. So just to give you a few examples and try to minimize how important you think they are. In this room, many of you might be familiar with the fact that Chicago Public Schools closed something like 40 or 48 elementary schools in the 2013-14 school year. So that's obviously going to affect the elementary market different than the high school market. 2 points to suggest that's not a big issue here. First, at most, 1.6% of Teach for America teachers taught at these schools in any year while they were all open. And because it happened the year before the intervention, I can identify the impact of this by controlling for it separately, and it attenuates my estimated treatment effects by about 10%. So it might be driving some of it, but only a small portion. The next is that, I don't show it today, but the elementary school cohort has grown a lot more than the high school cohort. I'm just going to control for that because I observe it. And then finally, there might have been organizational changes that led to a change in how people were assigned to high school and elementary. Also, I won't show anything today, but in the paper, I use a triple difference where I compare the Chicago high school elementary change to the same change in 4 regions, which would control for any organizational level changes, and the results are basically the same. So I don't actually estimate it in that kind of simple way I described. I use individual level data and estimate this individual level regression, where the treatment effect is just the coefficient on an indicator variable for being a high school teacher in Chicago in 2014. I do include all the data from the other regions, but they're only affecting the coefficients on the controls to give me a little more precision. The results are basically unchanged with slightly bigger standard errors if I don't. So here, this is the actual predicted outcome under the old mechanism. It has a region cohort fixed effect, a grade level cohort fixed effect. I control for all the individual
regions. This is all those other regions then?
So I observe 4 other regions. You can think of it as just Chicago, a cohort fixed. You can drop the R and then.
So you're really not just comparing elementary and secondary. You're comparing the secondary treatment group, right?
Yeah.
To the elementary in Chicago, but also to the elementary and secondary and all these other regions.
So I'm not actually going to identify this coefficient using any of that other variation, other than I'm including them in the regression just to get a more precise estimate of the impact of the covariates. But any high school elementary differences in other regions would load onto this coefficient. So it's only within Chicago residual variation.
So where's your treatment effect?
So the treatment effect is this coefficient in blue, which is an indicator for being a high school teacher in Chicago in 2014.
Versus an elementary school teacher, right?
So it's 0 for everyone else, which includes teachers in other regions and teachers, elementary school teachers in Chicago. Yeah, so.
Oh, okay.
But the same thing you could do if you, just to fix ideas about how this is happening, you could include region, cohort, grade level fixed effects, so an indicator for all of them. Basically run a regression controlling for these individual covariates and cohort size, and take the residuals from that, and then you could just subtract the high school. That would give you the residual variation that I'm going to use to identify the treatment effect. That's the only purpose of the other regions.
Okay, I'm confused a little bit by the complexity of this. How many years do you have?
I have 7 years.
Okay. What would be totally, tell me if this is completely naive. What if I thought of this as, I've got 7 time points on one unit, which is the elementary schools.
Yes.
And I have 7 time points on the high schools.
Yep.
Each one of those means, or each one of those has some kind of standard error to it.
Yep.
And I'm trying to see, I mean, when I do the inference, I really want to know how much wobble is there among the 7 within within the elementary sector.
Yep.
How much wobble is there without treatment? How much wobble is there in the high school? And I'm going to weigh what I see as the treatment effect against this wobble of just these very few units.
Yes.
And the only reason you're using all these, I is what again? The kid? No.
So I is just an indicator for the treated cohort.
For the treated cohort.
Yeah, so it's 1 for every teacher in the treated cohort.
For a teacher. Yeah, so I is a teacher.
Yeah, I here, yeah, the subscript I is a teacher.
The only reason you're using the teachers and all this other stuff is because you want to measure what was happening at the elementary in a certain year. That's it.
I want to control for characteristics of the teachers I observe.
Yeah.
So it's basically the predicted market level outcome,
Right.
conditional on who's in it.
Right.
But I think you're...
But they're basically 14 adjusted means.
Yeah, so
Those 14 adjusted means are your data.
Exactly.
Okay.
I 100% agree. I'm going to cluster by region and grade level. So I'm going to have all the inference I show is based on a t-test with 12 degrees of freedom based on that. In the paper, I actually go even, in the appendix, I do exactly what you were thinking of, and I use a non-parametric permutation test and basically just compare the observed treatment effect to the prior year's differences.
I wonder whether it would make sense to write down a very, very simple theoretical model that would have the true means of those true 14 means, and as being basically, if you knew those,
yeah,
you could then, you'd still have to do some comparisons, and then sort of explaining to people how you estimate those. In other words, right now it seems like it kind of blows the reader away, when in fact what the logic of this is kind of simple.
It's this. This is the logic, and you can just think I'm using residuals instead of.
Do you have like a graph of those 14 numbers?
I will show you a graph.
Okay.
I promise I'll show.
Yeah,
at least for.
I'm just because I think that sometimes it's really great for everybody in the room to see these models, and we should probably spend even more time going over them. But it's also important to know, in essence, what's really happening.
Yeah, I'm going to show you, the graph I'm going to show you is using the residuals, but that's exactly what I'm going to show.
Yeah, quick question, because I'm not that familiar with UPS. On the student side, how different are the application processes between elementary schools and high schools? I know the high school one is very elaborate. I'm guessing elementary schools are more likely to stay within the catchment area, or like how much are these differences?
So someone in the room might know better than me about like systematic differences. My sense is that they're pretty similar. You apply to, my knowledge of this is basically limited to my wife who's a teacher. So she applied to high schools and elementaries, and it was a pretty similar process.
No, not on the teacher side, on the student side.
Oh, on this, there are charter schools for.
I'm thinking of time constant differences basically between elementary and high schools that may be sort of screwing up the counterfactual, but we can go back.
Yeah, but there are neighborhood schools at both the high school and elementary level, and there are also charters. The charter sector has been growing. Yeah.
James, are you thinking that perhaps the elementary schools are more homogeneous?
I mean, that's one thing. I'm thinking about like unobserved selection of different types of students into elementary schools versus high schools. I think that selection of students is going to be greater in the high schools than in the elementary schools.
Yeah, so maybe explain how your model solves that.
Well, so it would have to be some change in 2014 of the level of selection at the high school level, because I'm controlling for average differences between high school and elementary. So that would be, because I'm only using changes to identify the treatment effect, there would have to be like 2014 was very different in the sorting of students across schools.
I'm not sure that's true, but we can go back to it maybe later.
But that's why the variability and changes in the absence of treatment is such an important criterion for estimating how much uncertainty there is about this treatment.
Yeah, and I'll show you the data in just a couple slides. Okay, so first, now hopefully we're on board about, you can think about the simple difference in difference graph is effectively how I'm estimating these with the individual level regression in the background. So now I'm going to talk about the short run outcomes, the impact of outcomes determined at the match day, and then I will follow up by talking about the long run outcomes, retention and productivity. Okay, so first, how many teachers are attending interview days? So to give you a sense, the year before I worked with Teach for America, 63% of high school teachers attended an interview day, and 78% of elementary school teachers. So most teachers attend, but definitely not all. And only, even though the attendance rate was higher, only 29% of elementary school teachers were actually hired at this day, and 39% of high school teachers were hired at the interview day in the year before I worked with them. But if I look at the impact on this, which here I only observed data in 2013 and 14, so thinking about how many, I effectively have 4 units of observation, 4 markets that I observe here. So the inference is based on a t-distribution with 2 degrees of freedom. I find that the size of the interview day attendance rate increased by 6.1 percentage points, which that would have been, the teachers weren't aware of it. that there was a change. So Teach for America might have optimally invited more people, knowing that it was easier to implement deferred acceptance. And interestingly, I would say more interestingly, the hiring rate increased by 15 percentage points, which is actually almost a 50% increase in the interview day hire rate, which if teachers aren't hired at the interview day, a single Teach for America staff member is basically tasked with setting up one-off interviews because they don't want the teacher to kind of just be able to pick which school they go to. So the staff member has to spend a lot of time setting up Skype interviews or in-person interviews. So that's the same in both the high school and elementary market, but it's much more cost-effective for Teach for America to match at this interview day. Now, the other interesting question that's more of kind of an outcome that was more like participation is how teachers sorted differentially over schools and their preferences over matches. So here I look at this is just an indicator for whether or not teachers have any position listed in Teach for America's records. Some teachers quit very early and won't have any positions listed, but most teachers who quit early also have a position listed, even if they never started at that position. And the big difference here, so this is kind of the 3 types of schools that Teach for America Chicago places their teachers in. Chicago traditional schools, Chicago non-traditional, which is mainly charter, but also some alternative schools, and then Northwest Indiana schools. You can see this is, I estimate that about 45% of teachers would have been placed there in the absence of the program. But the big change here is a very large 7 percentage point increase in the probability that these teachers are going to traditional Chicago public schools. Which a simple way to think about the change is that we essentially gave teachers more input over their matches, and the teachers wanted to teach in traditional public schools.
Because they know it pays more, right?
So that could be one of the reasons. There is a differential pay. I think if you account for some of the bonus incentives, like some of the big charters might pay comparably, but traditional schools do pay more on average. That's a totally fair point. Either way, empirically, consistent with people liking being paid more, we find that teachers are sorting more into Chicago public schools, and most of this is driven by fewer teachers going to Northwest Indiana, although that's pretty imprecisely estimated. Now, I can also look among the teachers assigned to Chicago public schools. Many of you probably are familiar with the school quality rating program. So every school in Chicago is assigned to be level 1, which is your highest performing schools. You can think of the Hyde Park, most of the Hyde Park schools are level 1. Level 2 means it's kind of like a C. You're not doing great, but we're not going to fire all the teachers and the principal and shut the school down, which is level 3. So level 3 is like, you better get your act together or we're going to fire all the teachers and the principal and turn the school around. And then new schools, which are primarily going to be things like charter schools that have opened in the previous 4 years, have insufficient data to calculate a rating, so they're going to be the unrated schools. And the big change is that more teachers sorted into level 2 and level 3 schools. So they're essentially going from these new charter schools and the highest performing schools, and instead going to lower performing Chicago public schools, which from an equity perspective, if they are more effective, might be a good thing. Now, you might be interested in what would have happened under the old mechanism. So kind of an easy way to think about it is under the first offer mechanism, schools are given precedence over teachers based on the timing of the interview. The first school that interviews you gets kind of first dibs. Under deferred acceptance, if you remember going through those screens, the teacher's preferences break the ties. So I'm going to do a naive simulation, and I'm just going to run deferred acceptance, but instead of breaking ties with the teacher's preferences, I'm going to use the timing of the interview. So the interview round will be the teacher's preferences. And then I can look at the change in their rank of their assigned match relative to what match they would have gotten under the old mechanism. And I don't want to spend too much time on it, but most teachers actually got the same match, 73%. But of that 27% that didn't get the same match, 25% were happier, and something like 15% went from one of their least preferred schools to one of their most preferred schools. So potentially a lot happier, at least in expectation. For schools, you kind of went from a system where they were dictators and just said, I want you, to a system where the teacher had more market power. So it's more ambiguous for them. On average, they were about the same, but some were better off, some were worse off. Now, one aside here that might be of interest to anyone interested in whether schools and teachers, so an advantage of a cool feature of this project is that I observe these truthful preference reports of teachers and schools. So I can document how much heterogeneity there is in teachers and schools' preferences. Now, they only have 7 interviews, so they don't interview with the whole market. So I have to come up with a way to document this heterogeneity with the data I observe. So let's say there are 3 schools, and school 1 likes teacher A better than B and C. School 2 likes teacher B better than C better than D. So this A and D are different here. I'll say that schools 1 and 2 agree on the relative ordering of B and C. But now, if school 3 likes C better than A better than E, I would say down here that school 1 and school 3 disagree. Now, here, one school likes the teacher more, one school dislikes the teacher more, but in my data, there are actually sometimes 4 schools that interviewed the same pair. If it's just this 1 and 1, I'm going to randomly select a more preferred teacher, and I can say how often do schools and teachers agree about the more preferred option. And it turns out most of the time they agree, which suggests that schools at least have consistent preferences, even if they aren't able. This would suggest that they're able to predict who the good teachers are, and then the teachers just sort into those schools. So about 80% of the time, teachers and schools agree about the relative ordering of 2 members of the other side of the market, which I think is a new fact that's kind of in contradiction to some of this previous research that schools can't predict outcomes or can't predict teacher quality. Now, the main contribution of this paper is that I observe long-run outcomes, which has never been seen before in the centralized clearinghouse literature. So the first outcome I look at is retention. So here's the graph you were hoping for. So each data point here is just the predicted market outcome after controlling for all of those covariates and then adding back in a constant so that it's at the right levels. So the blue dots are, so this is the 2008 high school market. It's the treated market. And the orange dots are the elementary markets. So this line down the middle is the average high school outcome. And then these are the standard errors from a single test that the average difference is 0 across all of these years. So I can definitely rule out that that on average there's no difference between high school and elementary market. You can see here there are, like you said, there is some wiggle. On average there are no systematic differences in these 6 data points. But like here, for example, there's a bit of the high school market's higher. Here the high school market's higher.
Where is the intervention point again?
So I haven't shown you.
Oh.
So this is all pre-intervention, which is suggestive evidence. This is all suggestive evidence that it's a valid counterfactual. There's no systematic differences. Now if I add, the intervention takes place in 2014, and you can see, even though the high school market had actually been trending down, and the elementary market had been trending down less quickly, the high school market goes up, and the elementary market had a decline in 2014. As an organization, they were changing their admissions model, which could explain the decline in the elementary market. But this suggests that retention increased by 9.9 percentage points. Now,
if you went backward from 2.9 to, suppose we had the graphs reversed and we had 2.009 going to 2.008.
okay.
Would that look like a treatment effect?
This would look like a treatment effect.
I don't know.
I haven't looked at that. That's an interesting.
0.009 was the, was actually when it, let's say I got my numbers all mixed up. but I think that's not true.
So what I can tell you is that this is the biggest high school elementary school difference across the 7 years. It's close.
It looks like they crisscross. Well, the only one that looks comparable to me is that 208-009. Looks like there's kind of a crossover.
Yeah, which is also, in terms of proximity to the intervention year, it's the furthest back. If we look at the 2 years prior to the program, which, to be fair, this is the data we have. I don't want to discount the 2008 observation much, but they had been trending more similarly. David?
I'm trying to remember sometimes there's a trick that you could use with NIF where you sort of relax the parallel trends assumption by allowing for linear trends or something like that.
So here I'm allowing for, I actually use years, but I show the linear line because I'm trying to show kind of two pieces of information. One is the pre-trends differences, a test of whether those are zero. And then I want to show you kind of the levels. I actually use year fixed effects.
Oh.
So I just require that they have the same time shocks. I'm not actually requiring that they're linear. Okay. Now, one other piece of evidence that would suggest that this is driven by the intervention. I don't just observe retention through the 2-year commitment. I observe retention through various landmarks in the Teach for America experience. So this is the period that the intervention takes place. This is before the summer training. 2 of the 3 interview days took place prior to the summer training. 1 of them took place here. It was also the smallest one. So most of the people who are going through this are going through here. This is the observed outcome. This is the estimated counterfactual, which is the predicted outcome. It's basically the observed outcome minus the estimated treatment effect. So just keep in the back of your mind, this is an estimate with the standard error equal to the standard error and the treatment effect. But you can see almost all of that 9.9 percentage point increase in retention is driven by fewer teachers quitting very early in their Teach for America. So these teachers never even show up on the first day. These are teachers who you can think go to the interview day and say, I got matched with that school, not a chance, I'm gonna go take that consulting job. Whereas there are declines at every other point, but the bulk of the change is driven by here. And just to show you the actual estimates of the treatment effects, in this intermediate window, it's noisy. You might think a particularly bad outcome is a teacher quitting during the school year. The point estimate is negative, obviously, because they're all negative, but it's too imprecise to say it's different than 0. But we do have statistically significant, using this t-test with 12 degrees of freedom, impacts on quitting before you even start summer training. And then there's also this quitting after kind of mid-year in the second year, which is kind of a weird outcome. So people in this room might understand or might already appreciate that teacher retention is an important outcome. But just to kind of drive that home, retention is one of Teach for America's top objectives. So if you're familiar with criticism of Teach for America, the primary critique of them is that this 2-year commitment's not enough, turnover's too high. So retention is important for Teach for America from a branding perspective. And because they're an alternative certification program, they have government documents applying to be an alternative certification program. And the #1 goal they list is increasing their retention. So from an organizational perspective, it's without question an important outcome, maybe the most important. And retention and recruitment are very costly. So if Teach for America doesn't have to recruit a new teacher to replace the teachers that quit, that's $11,000 they saved for every single teacher. Now there are about 400 teachers in 2014, so if you apply that 9.9 percentage point reduction to all 400 teachers, that's a pretty big number in money saved. Also, Imazeki has a paper where she looks at how much teacher salaries affect retention and finds that actually a smaller, in real terms, increase in retention comes from a $8,000 increase in salaries. So applied to all teachers, that would also be very expensive. And finally, the best RCT evidence by Mathematica suggests that Teach for America teachers are better in the sciences and math and at least as good in English and reading subjects. So it might be better to keep more TFA teachers in the classroom. But I actually observe performance, so we can look at the impact on performance. So how do you measure performance if you're Teach for America? You have teachers teaching at all grade levels, pre-K through high school, in charter schools and traditional schools, alternative schools, and Northwest Indiana schools, so it's different school districts, grade levels. There's a lot that's different. So what Teach for America uses is, at the start of every year, that manager of teacher leadership development goes to the school and figures out what assessments are available, and they determine a growth goal for that teacher's classroom. So it's based on where the students are starting and what assessments are available. So then, based on that growth goal, they define an outcome called percent benchmark achieved, which is just the percent of that goal at the start of the year that's actually achieved. So if they want your students to grow 3 points, and your students grow 3 points on average, percent benchmark achieved would be 100%. If they grow 4 points or 5 points, it would be 166%. Now, the advantage of this is it's defined. I'll show you it doesn't seem to be controlling for the characteristics of the schools adequately, but it is Teach for America's preferred performance measure. So first, you obviously don't observe performance if the teacher quits before they ever teach. Somewhat surprisingly, I don't actually see, this is looking at whether I observe a performance measure in year 1. I don't see an increase in the coefficient's positive, but it's too imprecise to say it's significant in observing this performance, which it might just be for, you could tell a story that at these lower performing schools, the teachers are not submitting their performance to Teach for America's data or something, but I don't actually see a difference in how often I observe the performance. But these next 4 columns I'm about to show you are actually the impact on standardized percent benchmark achieved. So the units here are standard deviations of the elementary school's percent benchmark achieved distribution. And there are some extreme outliers, so I'm going to focus on the subsample where I drop people in the bottom percentile and top percentile. So if I just use the data I have, not accounting for the fact there's a 9.9 percentage point increase in retention, I see that there's a 0.27 standard deviation decrease in standardized first year percent benchmark achieved, and that's statistically significant. Now, you might say, well, of course you saw a decrease in performance, 9.9 percentage points, more teachers are staying. The worst teachers are now added to that average, it's going to go down. So one solution I use is to use multiple imputation to predict, based on characteristics of the teacher, how well they would have performed had they stayed. And using multiple imputation, the coefficient actually increases pretty significantly to 0.37 standard deviation decline, which suggests that it's not the worst teachers staying that's causing this decline. Now, retention's a binary outcome. You either stay or you don't stay. For performance, I can actually look at the distribution of outcomes. For this, if you're interested, I use Athey and Imbin's changes and changes, where you basically, it's the same idea. You essentially assume parallel trends in the quantiles of the distribution so that you can estimate a counterfactual distribution. It's a more non-parametric approach. So here, the solid line is the observed distribution of outcomes, and the dashed line is the predicted distribution of high school outcomes had the first offer mechanism been used. And this is just the predicted density. And you can see that it's basically a more compressed distribution, and it's also shifted to the left. So the average performance is lower, but the variance in outcomes is also lower. So if you're like purely egalitarian, it might be better. You can actually look at the impact at every single quantile. And in fact, the bottom 36 percentiles of teachers are performing better under the deferred acceptance algorithm. But above that, with one exception, the teachers are performing worse. So why are they performing worse? I can look at the predicted performance of the teacher based on the average performance of teachers who had been placed at that school in previous years. And I find that this isn't looking at their actual performance, it's just looking at the average performance of teachers who were placed at that school before the intervention. And I would have predicted about a 0.2 standard deviation decline, which if you attenuate those coefficients by 2/3, they're no longer going to be statistically significant. So this suggests that, so this is just, each column corresponds to how many prior teachers are required to be assigned to the school. Obviously, if you're the first teacher, you're not included in this analysis. But basically, if I require 1, 2, or 3 prior teachers, I still see between a 1 and a 2 standard deviation decrease in performance, which is suggestive evidence that the decline is driven by teacher sorting into lower performing schools.
Those are adjusted for the prior school level achievement, essentially.
Exactly. That's, I wouldn't, not necessarily adjusted, it just is the school level prior achievement of TFA teachers at that school. It's our best guess of the expected achievement of a new TFA teacher at that school.
Right, but I mean, I guess my question is, if the TFA teachers are, if the DAA teachers are sorting into low performing schools, don't you want to adjust that for some historical trend in those school performance?
So
what you're doing.
It's kind of like a 2-stage approach.
Okay.
So this is the impact on teachers, on the actual performance, and then this is the impact on sorting, where the outcome is that predicted performance of a teacher at that school.
Yeah, I mean, just to make this more straightforward.
Yeah.
You thought of this as an ITT analysis, and you're going to adjust for a pre-measure.
Yeah.
Can't you do that more simply and find?
The reason I'm worried about that is it feels like a bad control, because it depends on the mechanism where you're sorted. So that's why I went with this 2-stage, more complicated approach. But I could control for.
You don't think that's exogenous? The prior scores of those schools before those people even applied to this program.
Well, the prior scores I think are exogenous, but which school you're assigned to within the market is dependent, and this is based on the school you're assigned to. So this is basically another way of showing you the result I showed earlier, that they went from level 1 to.
For everybody to know, when you can use something simple-minded like what I'm suggesting.
Yeah.
It's a bad idea for what you said.
Yeah, I should be better at explaining that though.
No,
That's.
I just want to make sure we all get it.
Yeah.
I want to be sure I get it first.
Yeah, and
Thank you.
I hope you get it, because.
No, yeah.
Okay, so I can't say 100% of the effect is determined by this sorting across schools, but this is suggestive evidence that they just sorted to schools where it's harder to be more effective. And so that's my last result slide. So just as a recap, this intervention basically gave teachers way more autonomy over their matches, and they sorted into traditional public schools in Chicago that were lower performing schools that also paid.
They're saying Mother Teresa is really doing a bad job because in the districts where she went around trying to save people, she had a low saving rate or something. Is that what we're saying here?
I wanted to say that Mother Teresa was successful because she was in districts that were hard. So if I took
your analysis reveal her to be successful, or would it make her look bad?
So this analysis would make her look bad, and then the point would be actually she's predicted to do bad based on where she's working. So that's, I don't want to take, I think that it's still a little mixed. It seems like there wasn't much of an effect on performance. Like it seems like it really just, the teachers were happier and there were more of them, which is, I think, at least for education, they could have done something very great outside of Teach for America, but getting more teachers in disadvantaged schools seems like a good thing. So this suggests that it's kind of like a school fixed effect, and it's pretty hard to break that norm, even if you're really interested in working at that school. So just as a recap, the deferred acceptance gave teachers more control. They chose to go to lower performing, higher paying traditional public schools. And they were happier. Both, I didn't show you, but their reported satisfaction's higher, their expected preferences are higher, and their retention was higher. So all the evidence says they were happier. There's this ambiguous evidence about whether the students were better off. seems like there wasn't an effect after noticing the sorting outcome. And like I said at the beginning, revealed preference suggests that it was better, at least for Teach for America, because they adopted this moving forward for all of their teachers in Chicago. Thinking about how this could be applied, because obviously this is a very weird baseline mechanism for a very weird subset of teachers. So what does this teach us more broadly about education markets? So the market for teachers already in Chicago, at least, looks similar to the deferred acceptance algorithm, where teachers propose to their most preferred school. They actually have to apply to it. And then the school accepts their most preferred teacher that proposes to them. You could really cut application costs, like I mentioned earlier, by using a centralized system that would actually mimic that decentralized market. And that would expand the pool of teachers applying to schools, because there's some cutoff where teachers aren't going to apply to 500 schools. One comment is one reason these algorithms are applied is usually because there are no prices in the market, which help get to that efficient mechanism. The efficient solution would be if we were able to perfectly observe how effective teachers are at impacting student outcomes. Just performance pay based on that would make it so teachers fully internalize where they're better, where their comparative advantage is greatest. So that might be the simplest solution, but working within the political economy constraints, this type of mechanism might have big benefits for districts. Thanks so much. Thank you for the questions.